just want you to know I practiced this word about 20 times to make sure that I did not mispronounce it.
I have a question. Has anyone ever said with all due respect and then not followed up with a zinger?
His side of the bed. If I come in and I'm on the other side, he will move it. Yeah, that's it.
Which side do you like? With all due respect, you make a good point.
Cheery Oreos! Toasted Oreos!
Mute. He's muted.
I love what he's saying. He doesn't need sounds.
You're so small, squishing your head, Joseph.
You can.
Do it with me, Joe.
With all due respect, you really do look handsome, Bruce. Cheery Oreos! Toasted Oreos!
Look at you. You are insane.
How did I do that?
You're
How did I do
insane.
that? You just made the intro reel. Yes, you did. Well, hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It is April 21st. It is a glorious day in the history of the world, in the history of humanity, because we get a chance to spend some time together. This is a show about hope, positivity, and optimism. And I have to tell you, in some respects, we're going to start off maybe not exactly overly optimistic. Well, it's good to know, and it's amazing to celebrate National Libraries Day, to thank a librarian. My mother started out as a librarian, but unfortunately in South Africa over the last week or so, we had, and I should actually switch off the music because just an absolutely terrible, a travesty, a tragedy, a fire at the college that I studied at, that I graduated from, University of Cape Town, a fire on campus. The worst part of it, this is the Jagger Library. This is the library. Can you imagine a college campus in flames? Can you imagine this is what a library with so many books, with so many memories, with so many archives just absolutely reduced to rubble. It is one of the greatest tragedies maybe in the history of the country in terms of thinking about its history. And if there's any bright part of it, and there's not much, some of the rare books apparently were protected and saved in a fireproof vault as well. But yeah, a terrible thing to have to happen. And I think we just have to kind of be mindful of just how important the power of the written word is, the power of books, the power of penmanship, which is something we'll talk about when we bring Vicki Znavor onto the show. She is an author and leadership coach, and we'll bring the music back because this is the world we live in now. It's a manic depressive world, right? We go from the highs to the lows, to the highs, to the lows, to the highs, and we just roll with the punches. Mr. Tom Morris is here, our resident world's happiest philosopher. He says, good day to you, fellow philosophers, troublemakers, and rabble-rousers, square pegs in a round hole. That's exactly what we are here on the show. So glad Tom is with us. It is not his bedtime, which is always a good thing as well. So Vicky is our hump day guest. Another gift from Melissa Wilson. And then tomorrow, Tina Greenbaum will be on the show at 9 o'clock. A little bit of late night JAFFE. And then on Friday, the same man, Mr. Tom Morris, will grace us as my co-host when we talk about the week that was. Well, the week that was is actually right now. So we're in the week that was. We're in the week that is, but the week that was will be in a couple of days' time, and look forward to being able to reflect on my amazing guests, on Trigger, on Drew, on Vicky, and on Tina as well. Little update on the JAFFE coin. I think it's a little higher today. The JAFFE coin, it is bearing down on $2. That's all it costs to buy into the expanding value set, the value creation of the JAFFE economy. Whether you are a JAFFE coin holder, a regular on the show like Mr. Tom Morris, or a previous guest. We are all part of an expanding community, as is all of my wonderful, wonderful Facebook friends. Mr. Lewis Hawks, there is Mark and Q-Rock, Mr. Jeffrey Sass. I actually sang happy birthday to him playing the harp that I learned how to play by downloading a harp instrumental MP3. Mr. Michael Sharp, Jeff Cutler, Stuart Lipschitz, Sharon Levitt. Happy birthday to all of you. And Heidi Browning Pearson. Heidi was kind enough. She is the Chief Marketing Officer of the NHL, and she was kind enough to help my daughter out recently at a career fair. So thank you so much, Heidi Browning, for that. Well, let's get into our seated soliloquy. And we're going to talk a lot today about authenticity. We're going to talk a lot today about stories, and not just stories, but your story, and not just your story, but owning your story. So Vicki Znavor, my guest today, she wrote Authenticity Reawakened, the path to owning your life story and fulfilling your purpose. I'm writing this entire soliloquy based on my interpretation of her very thought-provoking title and subtitle alone, nothing else, sight unseen, and I cannot wait to discuss this with her in person. So let's start with the title, Authenticity Reawakened. The implication here is that it was once there, but then it wasn't. But it can be brought back to life. It can be resurrected from its slumber. I have many questions. When were we authentic? And when did we lose it? You know, and is this same thought true for other aspects associated with children? Creativity, curiosity, innocence, naivete, intention, spirit, and purity of thought. When did we lose this? And why? And what role does social media play in all of this? And has it actually led to a premature loss of authentic self? The word has become a bit of a trigger, insofar that people tend to roll their eyes and dismiss it as a cliche. But as I heard from one of my guests, it doesn't have to be. We can and we should fiercely guard it, protect it, defend it from becoming nothing more than a throwaway or discarded value. Also, who gets to be authentic? Can an inanimate object like a corporation, a brand, be authentic? And if so, how? Now, let's talk about the subhead of the book and the dual ideas of owning your life story and fulfilling your purpose. Both of these intertwined ideas reflect movement and dynamism. They are not one-dimensional. Your story is not past, present, or future. It is all three. It is happening right now. It's a novel, perhaps a masterpiece. Hopefully not all fiction, possibly a compendium of short stories, or maybe a collection of independent and yet related chapters of a longer book or even series. Owning that story is less about royalties to the rights and more about taking control or ownership of your fate, your potential, your purpose. And fulfilling that purpose implies having a semblance or vision of what it is in the first place, or maybe what it has the possibility of becoming. Many of us spend our entire lives in search of excellence, in search of our purpose, in search of our story. Might I suggest that your search doesn't just begin today, but began when you first asked your first question, accompanied by the glorious question mark that said, "To be continued." Now it's time to continue today's episode by bringing on my guest, Vicki Znavor. Vicki rose from being an entry-level clerk with only a high school diploma to becoming a highly recognized C-suite human resource executive. She did this while raising a family, while going to night school for years where she earned her bachelor's degree and an MBA. She's passionate about people doing their best work and believes that this happens when you bring your true self to life and to work. And now she's teaching some of the most critical lessons she discovered about being authentic in the workplace to others with her new book, Authenticity Reawakened, The Path to Owning Your Life Story and Fulfilling Your Purpose. Let's bring her onto the show. Vicky, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Boy, Joe, I love that soliloquy. I wish I had you here when I was writing the book. That was fantastic.
Well, it is completely inspired by you in the book. So,
Thank you.
The alpha and the omega, if you like.
There you go. For sure.
No, I mean, it's just it's a beautiful subject. It's an important subject, and yeah, we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so and a Zoom after show discussing it. You are guest number 240. 240.
I know. It's amazing.
And you do realize that this will be my best show ever.
I do, absolutely. And I'm going to give it my best shot, Joe. I must say, I listened to one of your other shows and you said you've never been described as looking like George Clooney. And I would say that I've never been described as being a hump day guest. So there you go.
Well, so it is a world, it is a day of firsts.
That's right.
I'm looking at some of comments. Joey DeMont says, owning your story. Maybe I should try that. Well, he did. He just published his first book, his memoir of a recovering douchebag. And you know what? Every moment that I interact with Mr. Joey DeMont, he's less of the D word as well. So he absolutely is taking that advice, owning that story. And Anna Bowman says, I'm so sad to hear about that library. Tom says, throughout history, we've lost so many books and libraries to fire and other disasters. We should treasure what we have and recognize, of course, that it is that, right? It is the ultimate treasure.
For sure. You know, libraries have always been really important to me. In fact, I had a somewhat chaotic childhood. And as a child, I can remember being 7, 8 years old, and I always found great solace at the library. And in fact, some of the books that I read taught me about what's a family like? You know, Laura Ingalls Wilder books, for example, I learned about family. So every time I walk into a library, I always tell people, look at the books on the shelf. That was someone's dream. Even the worst books, those were someone's dreams and come to life with the intention of being of service.
Right. And my mom is watching today, and I hope she saw the beginning. You know, as I said,
yes.
she was a librarian. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole country is in mourning. But sometimes, you know, hopefully, I mean, as best as it can be, you know, from the ashes, the phoenix rises, reemerges, and is reborn.
Right.
So we'll see. We hope.
Yes.
But let's jump again from one end of the emotions to another and find out some fun facts about you. Hopefully not too embarrassing, Vicky, but we did send our detectives into the field to dig up the dirt on Znavor. And here's what we found. We found that you have always, this is a very tough image to basically have to find, by the way, you know, other than a mermaid or a merman or a mer person. But you've always, you talk about finding great comfort by being near large bodies of water. And for you, it's been Lake Michigan. Maybe it's because you are an Aquarian, a water bearer. So talk a little bit about the peace, the serenity, the power of the large body of water.
Sure. You know, I think it's when you have this realization of how small you are in the universe, and that Mother Nature is really always in charge, even if you think that you have great control over things. Just the soothing waves, for example, have always brought great comfort to me when I was a teenager, which all of us have teenage angst, as we all know. And oftentimes when I was struggling with something, I lived within walking distance of Lake Michigan, and it has played such a role in my life. I Lake Michigan now is right across the street from my home. And I would go and I would sit on a bench and I would just contemplate and try to, we didn't have the word meditation back then. I'm not actually a very good meditator, but I found it to have meditative qualities. And I just listened and looked at the lake and thought about who I was and had this realization that all the stuff that's going on in a teenager's life, it always reminded me that those things were small in the context of my entire life, which hopefully I would have had many years ahead of me. And then I just needed to just be once in a while. And I would say that philosophy has stayed with me my entire life.
There are some amazing, concepts when we think about water, right? Water can be as serene and peaceful and meditative, the calmness of it. And then, of course, water can also be the most powerful, fierce, destructive force.
Yes.
And then another thought, when we kind of just extend this metaphor or even analogy, is thinking about the idea of feeling small or being or it's humility, right? It's the ability, whether it's a grain of sand or stars in the sky, when we think about how small we really are. And I guess we have a choice, a conscious choice. Does that make us feel insignificant and less important, or actually does it ground us and allow us to recognize that we're part of something so much bigger than us, and yet we have a part to play in terms of this beautiful, expanding universe or tapestry?
For sure. And that's exactly how I felt with the latter. And that I had, humility has played a role in my entire being. But I also knew that as small as I was, I could make a difference. And I really have tried. And also, I think it tells you that, it's life has many dimensions to it, and that you can continue to learn and grow and be. And also you recognize that other people are doing the same thing, and we're all imperfect creatures. And I think sometimes the nature reminds us of that there's a purpose.
And we're going to get into that as well. Tom says, from an evolutionary perspective, we came from water. Our bodies are mostly water. We need water more than food. Water is one of the great metaphors. Its horizon evokes the infinite.
Yeah, I love that, Tom.
Very, very, very poetic. He's on fire because he adds, hey, Tom, you're going to get your chance on Friday. No, I'm kidding. So much great Chinese philosophy is summed up in the adage, be like water, flow around obstacles. Well, we will talk about obstacles, and we'll talk about how in many respects, people build up these obstacles, these walls, these barriers and boundaries that maybe prevent them from finding their purpose. But before we have a conversation on that, let's talk about your penmanship, because that's another interesting fact about you, and it stems from your grandfather. When you were 5, your grandfather, who you never met, wrote in his Bible, and it was the most beautiful handwriting you had ever seen. And this ultimately has inspired you to be what is a master of penmanship?
Yeah, Joe, I was really curious what you were going to drag up. So you definitely do your homework. Thank you. Well, and it was such a, again, I go back to a lot of chaos in my family as a child and that kind of thing. But I only saw my grandmother who lived in Kentucky. So my dad is from Mexico. My mother is from Kentucky. And I remember being 5 or 6 years old, opening his Bible and seeing this beautiful, perfect, deliberately executed penmanship, just beautiful. And I just told myself, and I've had lots of moments in my life over the years where I've told myself something at a young age, and I just stuck with it. I always say, I'm in the story, the tortoise and the hare, I am definitely the tortoise, but I do keep going. And so I just sat down and I made a pronouncement to my family. I'm going to write as well as Grandpa wrote. And I would practice and practice and practice literally for years. And I would say that most of the time, and my husband kind of rolls his eyes every time he hears it, but most of the time when people see my handwriting, they make a comment about it, that it's the best that they've ever seen. And I always think, thanks, Grandpa. That's the one thing I can carry on from you.
I wonder how important it is to still write. I mean, actually, I got a handwritten thank you. I was recently on Brian Kramer's podcast, and he sent a thank you, a beautifully written thank you, handwritten thank you note. How, I mean, it's again just like a book, right? There is probably a lost art to actually being able to take the time to write. And I have to say, I hate it. Even when I fill out a form, I feel like my hand, my fingers go into spasm. But I remember, growing up, even going through school, how drafts got written before they were typed, if you even had the ability to type.
That's right.
So it's not just penmanship, but I think the ability just to use a damn pen.
For sure. Yeah. And it does feel like art. I didn't have the gift of being able to draw. And some of my distant relatives I've heard are great artists. But to me, it does feel like I have my red pen in my hand right now. I almost always have one. And it really does feel like art. And, I know when I do holiday cards or birthday cards or something like that, I always tell my friends, I want the envelope to feel like a gift. So yeah, everybody's got their own thing, and some people can sit at a computer and that feels like art to them too. So whatever it is that makes you feel artistic or brings out a side of you that makes you feel good, I say go for it, do it.
I mean, you can't do that to me. It's unfair to be able to say something as meaty and awesome as I want the envelope to look like a gift because I mean, there's so much to even just unpack in that statement, right? Which is the fact that typically the envelope, the gift wrapping, everything around is thrown away, is almost seen as superfluous, as just a necessary evil. But if you can actually make the envelope special, a gift in of itself, I mean, that's the ultimate, right? The ultimate is the ability to take that which we take for granted, that which is mundane, that which is considered, to be filler, and flip it on its head.
Yeah, I think it starts with intention. And as I think about authenticity, I think a lot about the word intention. And so if your intention during the holiday season is to just check it off your list and get it done, that's one thing, that's your intention. But if your intention is to truly connect in a way that you can with people that you love, then whatever it is that you do should feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, Tom is right? This was part of the Steve Jobs genius, right? That the packaging was part of the art, and everyone copied it. Amazon copied it with the Kindle, that you could actually, and I think what it also said, which is if they care this much about the packaging, if they're prepared to actually invest cost into the packaging, unnecessary cost, which of course you could interpret it two ways, right? One is, well, are they passing that cost on to me, or is it an expression of value in terms of they really must love the product if they're prepared to wrap it and shroud it, envelop it with this art.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah.
So I'm just thrilled to talk about, well, first of all, I mean, I asked lots of questions about,
I love that.
In the soliloquy. You can tackle any of them as you want, but they all relate to authenticity reawakened. And I will, for those of you that would like a link, of course, you can go to Amazon, but why would you need to when I will post the link for you? Just click on the link that I've just done. You talk about this idea of reawaken. So that was the first thing. I'm pretty sure that you chose these words very intentionally and deliberately.
Yes. And I loved that you picked up on that, Joe, because the title, and I know that Cherise in her interview with you also talked about how difficult it is just to find a title. And I thought about it, and Melissa Wilson, my publisher, and I went back and forth. But when I got to the term reawakened, it made all the sense in the world to me. And that's because who we are during our lifetime, we as a child, you are who you are, and we hopefully will talk a little bit more about that innocence and authentic person that we are as children. And then the world gets its hands on you, and you start to mold and conform. But as you go through your life, you get these experiences, and then they shape who you become, and they make you rethink who you are. And then it sort of starts all over again. It's this, grow, learn, rethink who I am. And as you get older, so now I've hit the wonderful age of 60. And when I get as a 60-year-old, I look back and I say, all of these things have made sense over time. So it's this constantly checking in with myself. Who am I? Asking that question. There's a powerful exercise that I recommend we all do from time to time. It's worked well for me, standing in front of a mirror and saying, who am I? And then listening to the answers that come to you. Am I proud of how I showed up for my family? Am I proud of how I'm showing up for my friends and colleagues? Am I proud of how I'm showing up for myself? Am I being a person of integrity because that's a personal value? Is that how I'm showing up in the world? And then when the answer is no, and of course, we all have times in our lives where we're not showing up the way we want to. That's then the moment where you say, okay, something's got to change. And then you take action to change that. You grow and you learn. And then the process just keeps happening over and over and over again. So this concept of reawakening, I do believe that we are born with who we are, and also the potential of who we can become. And if we pay attention and grow and learn over our lifetimes, this reawakening does happen, and it can be very powerful. But there also has to be intention behind it.
So one thing I did pick up there is that the reawakening, yes, it may be part of this idea of it was once there and then it wasn't, and it was lulled or maybe shocked into sleep or slumber.
Mm-hmm.
But you also mentioned that this is not a one-off. This is a
Mm-hmm.
constant reawakening. It's a constant reimagining, as you, I guess, go through life and change and are exposed to different experiences, good, bad, and ugly,
Mm-hmm.
that reawakening happens again and again and again.
Yes, indeed, it does.
So let's do that. Let's go back now to the connection back to being a child.
Yeah.
And because, again, we hear a lot of this concept of authentic self, authenticity. I often say one of my little, flippant lines is you can't fake authenticity. But let's talk about when do we all have this authenticity? Is it something that is part of our childhood?
Well, yes. And it certainly, I think kids start figuring out what's acceptable at a very young age. But for sure, if you watch a 4-year-old playing with whatever toy he or she decides to play with, and they're just delighted, that is pure joy. They're, expressing themselves however they express themselves, whether it's laughing out loud, whether it's, looking serious, whatever it is. But those things really are there and you can see it. But then what happens is that the parent who wants the child, again, good intentions, but they want the child to be perceived a certain way, a way that reflects positively on who they are as parents and people. So if Sally says something at church and she shouldn't have said it out loud at the moment, she gets corrected. If somebody messes up their clothing because they were outside enjoying whatever, the dirt and nature and all of that, but they mess up their perfectly, fine attire, then they get corrected. So they learn really quickly, oh, I'm going to be rewarded if I do things the way the people in my life who I respect want me to do them. And then, I'll talk a little bit about my childhood. When I was 7 or 8, I learned my parents were both alcoholics, and I love my parents and they did the very best in life. So no disrespect at all to my parents, but I learned that the inconsistency that's in a childhood home where parents are, struggling with addiction. So you learn to then watch for signs that something's going to go wrong, that there's going to be some kind of engagement, whether it's between parents or parents and children, or just watching your parents being sad as they deal with some of these things. That's when you start learning, like, okay, I've got to be perfect. I don't want to cause my parents any extra angst. I've got to be an adult. And for me, that started around the age of 8. So, I know very much as I went back to my own childhood and I did the exercises in my book. As an example, I talk about owning your story. When I was a teenager, the last thing I wanted to do was share what I was going through with anyone. And I didn't talk about it at all. I actually did quite the opposite. I was the perfect student, the perfectly nice, polite young lady. I didn't invite friends to my home because I didn't know what they would see, those kinds of things. And I learned to put that away. Now, as I've grown into an adult, I know for sure that there are many gifts, even though, again, that wasn't a positive experience, but there were many gifts that I got as a result of some of those things. Being an HR executive, it's really important that you know about people and that you are, in tune with and empathetic to human beings and their needs and situations and all of that. I also learned from my experience that, my parents would get laid off from their jobs, things like that. And the last thing I wanted to do as an executive was put another child in that situation where they're worried about their parents and how they're going to manage expenses and things like that. So I was a very deliberate, thoughtful executive, very fiscally responsible executive. So I'm very grateful for those gifts, but those things weren't certainly things that I talked about as a child or a teen.
I want to go back and unpack a few things you said,
Mm-hmm.
but before I do that, I want to talk about HR for a second.
Mm-hmm.
My sense, look, the last job that I had, the last proper W-2 was 2002. I now describe myself as unemployable. I mean, who in their right mind would want to employ me? I am so damaged now, damaged goods. But I, from my first experience with HR when I came to the US in 1997 to my last experience in 2002, I witnessed what I thought was a sea change in HR, where HR was your best friend. They literally had the employees' back. And they would go to war for them, to where the fact that HR became henchmen. They became the bean counters henchmen. They became nothing more than the purveyors of pink slips. Is that an accurate feeling that HR in a way has gone through this this change or transformation in terms of being the advocate for the employee to the advocate of the not just the C-suite, but the P&L? And if so, if that is an accurate statement, what's it going to take, and can it return to that pure empath or empathic state?
Yeah. Well, they say that any positive attribute, if overdone, can become, a fault. And so I think for years, I used to get so irritated by this when I would hear things like, well, HR is going to finally get its seat at the table. And I thought, well, okay, I think we've always had our seat at the table, but how do we show up? I think it's probably been a bit of an overcorrection. There are still many, many, many fine HR leaders in the world today who have learned to do the delicate dance, if you will, of being. You certainly have to protect the balance sheet of the corporation and the company and all of that, but you also can't forget that the very first word in the function that you're a part of is the word human. So, for HR executives, I would say that, certainly you have to remember that being a human being, think about, again, this goes back to intention, being deliberate about intention. If someone is losing their job, it's a very difficult, perhaps the worst day of someone's life. And if you get so good at giving the speech about, you've lost your position, and then it's sort of the cadence of what the steps are in the process of exiting someone from an organization. I'll go back to my early HR career, and my whole career hasn't been in HR. But I always thought, and I still do today, that if you get so good at that job of telling someone that they're out of the company, that you forget that it's a human being. And I'll go back to that little girl or little boy at home who's going to be worried about their parent, then you really shouldn't be in HR anymore. Your time has come to find something that doesn't require as much humanity and empathy as a great HR leader can offer that role. But of course, you have to be fiscally responsible, and we know that. But, there have been times when I've said, I know when I was first trained in HR, they would say things like, never say you're sorry when you're exiting someone from the organization. And I never bought into that rule. I was sorry that someone was experiencing a difficult time. However, they might have, quote, deserved to lose their position. Maybe they did something that was completely unacceptable or whatever that might be. But it's still a really difficult time. And I was sorry that people were going through that. And just saying, I want to be here to support you however I can in this work. So I think, again, there are some, especially if I think about the push now for HR to, HR is at the table. They're actively talking about mental health and its importance, and how that really does help people succeed on the job, and why it's such an important component of the total rewards packages. And I'm really grateful that they're doing that. So I still think HR can be and is being great advocates for employees.
I mean, I'm so glad that you mentioned mental health, and you can't really have a conversation these days, not certainly, when the word humanity is present and at the table, without talking about DEI. I mean, the diversity conversation right now is just and it's diversity, equity, inclusion. It is not something that is an optional extra anymore, but the mental health aspect is as important. There was another mass shooting in the country, FedEx employee, ex-employee. And I was just thinking to myself, I mean, we sometimes, there are many factors, clearly, and we're not going to kind of go down a rabbit hole, but it really, does stem from the fact that there are moments of truth where that apology or that little bit of extra care, the human in human resources, can actually mean quite literally the difference between life and death.
That's absolutely right. And the other thing, I know years ago, someone told me every HR person should lose their job once. And that, once that happens, yeah, I know. And I would say that I probably agree with that. And because once you do, you say, oh, you know what, I understand what it feels like to sit in that table and across the table and hear those words. But you're right, absolutely. In a tough situation, it can absolutely mean the difference between life and death. And there's no more important role than that one for HR people.
I mean, one of the things that I've developed in Built to Suck, in my most recent book, is this idea of embracing your heresy. And the very first one is, what if you fired yourself? And I tell the story of Andy Grove when he, famously was fired himself and then rehired the next day. And I was thinking, like, the ability to actually implement that idea of every HR professional or executive being fired, they should literally go through it, even if it is simulated or some kind of a role play exercise. But they should go through all of those emotions, and quite frankly, there's a way to even probably simulate it in a way that other employees might not even know that, in fact, that it's happened. But at the highest level, I mean, I don't know how it could be scaled through an organization, but certainly anyone that really is at a certain level, you're absolutely right. And if it cannot be implemented even literally, I almost think it's a screening question in terms of being able to determine maybe a certain fit for an organization. Maybe all companies should be able to start asking that, which is, have you ever been fired? Have you ever lost your job? Have you ever been laid off? As opposed to talk about a time when you failed. What did you learn from it? Well, I've never really failed ever before. I used to answer that. And then I was like, no, I'm pretty sure that right now I just failed the question
For sure.
by answering it that way.
Right.
Vicky, I want to go into the book for a moment, and you talk about real life stories. And of course, the essence of today is about owning your story. So your quote, I know you've watched the show as well, so you know that I'll always look for a quote. And this is your quote. So your quote is, owning your story is the bravest thing you will ever do. This is, I've never heard of this person, but apparently they're going to make it. Someone by the name of Brené
Yes.
Brown. So, but why is it brave? Why is owning your story important? A, and B, why is it brave?
Well, owning your story is important because whether you acknowledge it or not, it's made you who you are. And so it really is at the core of authenticity, because you can't be authentic if you don't know who you are. So that's the first part. And the second part, in terms of why is it brave, it's because our stories, especially, the pivotal moments in our life that we can go back and pinpoint and say, gosh, that's why I do these things, or this is why this is such an important part of my humanity. A lot of those things, we've all gone through pain and suffering in our lives, every single human being. And so you have to come to terms with what some of those things have been that have impacted you in a negative way. And, the example I gave earlier with my parents, owning that, because I had pushed it so far down. And this is a common experience for all of us. We push things down that are unpleasant. And so bringing that to the surface as an adult years later does require you to examine those things and examine yourself and how you've shown up in the world as a result of it. So that's why it's brave, because it's not always pleasant. And I will just say that in my book, I say that obviously there have been situations that are quite violent and awful, and I've been blessed not to have any of those things happen to me personally. But if you're digging those things up and you haven't sought any support from professionals, I would highly recommend that you do that, because you do need help coming to terms with, what do I do with that story? How do I put it away? Do I still acknowledge it? That you have to acknowledge that it happened and it's part of who you are. But then what do I do with it going forward? You'll probably need the help of a professional.
I had just a weird thought as you were talking, which is I was thinking, during the last 14 months, certainly if we use Clubhouse as an example, people have really become so much more comfortable being vulnerable, and owning their story, and demonstrating their weakness, which in some cases is their strength. And then I thought to myself, as you were talking, that in the weirdest, almost kind of esoteric way, maybe we need to credit Mark Burnett and reality TV, because it seemed like we would be watching, whether it was The Bachelor or Survivor or American Idol, that everybody had a story, and each person's story was more, tragic than the one before. And I'm obviously
Right.
saying that with a little bit of drama, which is like, is it really possible that everyone can have a story like that? And maybe they're just trying to recruit people that have stories. But I'll tell you something, what I've realized over the last 14 months is that, everybody does have a story.
Everybody does.
And you know what? You find me someone that hasn't gone through some kind of life-changing, transformational moment, and I will show you a droid or a artificially intelligent clone or drone.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing is, the more you sort of go back to identify what your stories are, and then it doesn't become a negative. It actually strengthens you. So, I have this high voice and I'm pretty expressive and all those kinds of things. I stood out a little bit in this, at the executive tables and that kind of thing. But whenever I would have somebody say, "Oh, she's a nice lady," or, "This is going to be really tough," what I would say is, you have no idea. I have already, in my head, I would think, I have already gone through so much that's strengthened me. And again, that goes back to the power of your story. Your story can strengthen and fuel you to have the confidence to go forward in a much better, healthier, stronger way. So I just thought, bring it on, mister. I can take it. No problem.
It's, there are two parts, right? The first part is the importance of stories.
Yes.
And you have to be able to understand your story and know your story and tell your story before you can even own it.
Right.
But I mean, this is a red thread, which is the power of stories and storytelling. And of course, we're not talking about fiction. We're talking about life's story, your life story, my life story, our lives story.
That's right. And it's beautiful.
It certainly is, even in its mess.
Yes.
And I just actually saw a quote which has got nothing to do with stories, but it basically said, change is. I'll find you the quote because I don't want to mess it up. But what we will do is, in your book, you've got all these, as you say, real life stories that will help you understand. I just want to pick out a few of them that relate to authenticity. So the first one is this idea of how to best build your legacy. I love that idea because I always say you have to embrace your heresy to define or uncover your legacy. Talk about the importance of legacy. Why is it important to even think about leaving behind a legacy and developing a legacy while we're still our work in progress humans living our lives?
Yeah. Well, the first aha moment that I had as I started to think about legacy was that whether or not we accept it or know it or want to acknowledge it, we're all building a legacy. And the older that you get, the more you realize, I want to make sure that I leave something behind. I think that, all of us want somebody to have a fond memory of us once we're gone from this world. We want to have made a difference in somebody's life. And, this is one of the things I think parents oftentimes, if you're a stay-at-home parent, for example, you probably think, though you sort of put other people on a legacy, on a pedestal. Whereas your legacy as a parent, there can be no more important legacy than that. You're raising other human beings who are going to go out into this world and make their legacy as well. So just thinking about, and it goes back to intention, really. What do I want? How do I want to show up in this world? Am I showing up the way I want to? And how do I want people to remember me? I've seen other books that have talked about, writing your own eulogy, for example, and saying, what would you hope that somebody would say about you at your own funeral? And one of the stories I share there's a guy named Brian Floriani who heads up Bernie's Book Bank here in Illinois. And his grandmother and his father passed away on the exact same day. So he was at their shared funeral, and he heard all these wonderful things that people were saying about them. And he said, you know what? I thought about the fact that the people in my life would say very nice things about me at my funeral, but I wondered if they would be true. And I still get goosebumps when I hear that story about Brian would they be true? And I think that that's a good question as you're thinking about your own legacy, is if they said good things, would they truly be true?
Wow. I mean, that is, well, I'm also goosebumpy right now. I mean, and and it's funny because even when you watch television and people are talking about someone who has passed away, the only things they say are nice things, and it's not possible that everyone can be so kind and everyone can be such a good person. And you almost wish that there's the ability to say, look, they had their challenges. They were a conundrum. They were an enigma. I mean, I think there are certain beautiful ideas, the messiness of it. And that was remember I said I was going to find you a quote. It was actually about change. Change is hard at first, messy in the middle, but gorgeous at the end.
Love it.
And I think we've got to embrace the mess. We've got to embrace the messiness. That's what should be at the funeral, the messiness, which is how they've figured things out. And maybe they never quite figured it out, but they were trying. That's the effort.
Absolutely. And in fact, you mentioned Steve Jobs. And I would say that that's what I would, if I were giving, and no one would ask me to have given a eulogy for Steve Jobs, but that's exactly what I would have said about Steve. He was always trying. It was very messy, but he did a lot of amazing things that obviously we'll always remember who he was, but he sure as heck didn't get it right all the time.
Right. And of course, one of the things about Steve Jobs is he really, according to the biography, was not really a very nice human being. He did not put the human in human resource.
He did not.
But boy, oh boy, did he create great envelopes.
Yes, exactly.
We've just come full circle. I'm thinking maybe at my funeral they'll say, "Here lies Joseph Jaffe. He never missed a show. No, he never missed a soliloquy."
I think it's going to say he gave a darn good soliloquy.
His best soliloquy was when Tom Morris deputized for him. But here we go. Here lies Joseph Jaffe, a mystery wrapped around a conundrum, vying with a paradox, but with kindness.
That's right.
Well, thank you, I think.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about George Clooney too, and I would just say, as I was watching your podcast over the many last several months, I would say that the thought that I had was, you have a very expressive face that shows your curiosity about life and intelligence and I think deep curiosity. And so I like faces like that. They're better than George Clooney's.
Well, unless he comes on the show, I'll say, screw you, George Clooney.
That's right.
And if you are thinking of coming on the show, please come on the show.
That's right. Come on, George.
I mean, why not? Trevor Noah and George Clooney. I started off this journey trying to get Trevor Noah on the show, but I haven't given up. As Vince Lombardi said, I never lost a single game. I just ran out of time. Well, we may run out of time. We always seem to run out of time. Time flies when we are having fun. Yeah. But the last couple of things that I want to chat about is, the authentic self as it relates to your work self, to the mask that you put on, when you're at home versus when you're at the office. And now with this, hodgepodge, this hot mess, if you will, of work from home, there are two things that you talk about in the book. One is this idea of authenticity at work, but of course it's now authenticity at work at home. And then as it relates to there's a very practical use case or application, which is how to decide whether to stay or leave your job. So I would love for you to talk about this idea of what does it mean, authenticity at work, And do you believe in having, a different persona or an expression of your persona when you are at work versus not at work? And then, of course, finally, I would love to hear your thoughts on whether you should be staying in your job or looking for something new.
Sure. So I, in my book, I talk a lot about values also. And I think that values are so important. Your story really does help you to understand your values much more clearly. So as it relates to work, most workplaces, all of us wear a mask to some extent now, literally, but we all wear a mask to at work, and we hide, certain aspects of ourselves that maybe we're just not comfortable sharing. But if it's a value that is one of those things that you say, no matter what, I'm going to stand for this, then you absolutely have to define for yourself how is the best way for that to show up at work. So, for example, if your value is that, inclusion and diversity, and we're all talking about it, and I will just say, I hope that organizations stop talking about it and stop putting posters up and actually start applying the basic concepts of inclusion and diversity. But if that's really important to you and you see certain things at work happening, I don't care what level you are, you have to find a voice. You can even practice it in front of that mirror that I talked about to say, the next time this is said at work, this is what I'm going to say. So, for example, if someone says something discriminatory against somebody, you can say to that person, you've just touched upon one of my core values, and I would appreciate you never speaking that way in my presence again. And I honestly would say it doesn't matter who that person is. And again, if organizations are really focused on inclusion and diversity, then they've got to start living up to those times when their best executives aren't showing the values that they so beautifully tout in their marketing statements. And then as it relates to leaving your job, you know what? You know when it's time to leave your job. You just don't want to pay attention to it. I've been there a few times in my life. And, when you get up in the morning and your first thought is, I have to go to work today, instead of I get to go to work today. Those two things feel so different. When you're tossing and turning at night, when you're looking at your manager and you're trying to figure out how you're going to say things exactly right so that you're not, on the receiving end of some type of tirade. Those are things that, or it could still be positive. It could still be a positive thing. You've simply outgrown your job. It's not providing you with any stimulation at all. Those are the times when you say something's got to change or I've got to move on.
I think that both, this idea of owning your story and then being able to even apply that in a work environment, and not just a work environment, but a work environment where values are compromised or not, or are inconsistent with what you believe. I guess we would call it the mirror test, which is it sounds so simple. Stand in front of the mirror and just practice it. It's one of the pieces of advice I give to people when helping them with presentation skills, which is even the soliloquy. You've got to say it out loud, because when you say it out loud, it always comes out differently and sounds different, even to the words that are written on the page. And by the way, just little tangent, but what I noticed today, now that I've been playing around with music in the background, that the actual music now starts to impact the way that I even tell that story.
Wow.
And narrate that soliloquy. And as the music becomes more emotional and impactful, then I too move with the music as the music moves me.
Yeah, I was dancing back here when I was listening to it.
Well, I mean, I was dancing to everything that you've said. doing the internal lambada. Well, I mean, today has been so amazing, because this really has. It's been a conversation that has been so deep and profound, and yet, at times has been fun and frivolous. And maybe the best way to describe it is not a hot mess, but just exploring the beauty of messy, and what I would call, imperfect perfection or perfect imperfection.
Authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Real. Real. I said I wanted to revisit something, and I'll just maybe save it for the after show. But I took copious notes as you were talking about a parent's role in terms of molding their child into the image, maybe not their own image, but certainly a perceived or an image of perfection. And maybe that is that moment. But we can talk about that in the after show. For now, I want to tell you that authenticity, if you are ready to reawaken that authentic self, then you need to go out and buy Authenticity Reawaken. It's fairly obvious. The path to owning your life story and fulfilling your purpose. If you want to find out more about Vicky, just go to vickyznavor.com. You can connect with her on Instagram, on Twitter, and of course, LinkedIn. Vicky, thank you for sharing some of your amazing, your story, your authentic self and story with us. And now we're going to go and continue that story on the Zoom after show. But before we do, you know who comes next. It's Mr. Chuck Norris, letting you know.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
Go. And I will see you guys tomorrow night for Late Night JAFFE. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show. And if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit josephjaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.